Hi sir, I am John Andre Asuncion together with my group mates. We are group 3 and we are here to report about the patriotic responses and the development of nationalism during the years 1521 to 1800s or during the Spanish colonization era. First, let us define what is nationalism. Nationalism is the identification with one's own nation and support for its interests, especially to the exclusion or detriment of the interests of other nations. It is also a way of thinking that a specific group of people should be free from any control and free to rule themselves without the involvement of any other people. So nationalism or pagkamakabayan is a feeling or a point of view where your primary focus is for the greater good of your own nation and your fellow countrymen. When you stand against oppression or abuse to your country, then you express nationalism. Next, patriotism. Patriotism is the feeling of love, devotion, and vigorous support with a sense of attachment to a homeland or a country, and alliance with other citizens who share the same sentiment to create a feeling of oneness and unity. When many people express nationalism altogether and share hardships, challenges with each other, and create a sense of unification, then they practice patriotism. So, why people during the Spanish colonization era express nationalism and practice patriotism? This is because of Spanish abuse of power, which will be reported by my classmate Christian Oriel.
The Spanish term translated for slave or sapilitang paggawa in Tagalog. In other words, the polo servicios is equated to slavery. As a practice, it was employed by Spanish colonizer for over 250 years, which required forced labor of Filipino maids from 16 to 60 years of age or 40-day periods. Ipinatupad noon ng mga Kastila sa ilalim ng sistema ng komyeda ang tinatawag na polo e servisyo, kasapilin ng paggawa ng lahat ng mga kalalakihan na may kakayang muling galap ng trabaho. Kung ikaw ay may edad na mula 16 hanggang 6 na po, kabilang ka dito sa sapilitang paggawa na pinapatupad ng mga Espanyol. Hindi binayaran ng serbisyo ng mga Pilipino tumulong sa pagtatayo at pagkukumpuni ng mga gusali, tulay, galyon at timbahan na tumagal ng 40 days. Ngunit binaba ito sa 15 araw noong 1884. Ang ibang pulista sinama ng pamahalang Espanyol sa paiiligma sa mga Muslim at sinama sa ekspedisyon sa ibang lugar. Dahil dito, maraming pulista ang nawawali sa kanilang pamilya. Pulista ang tawag sa mga tao nagsasagawa nito, hindi kabilang sa polo e serbisyo ang miyembro ng prinsipalya o ang mga nasa mataas na antas ng lipunan. Mga lokal na opisyal gaya ng gobernadorcillo o kabesa de barangay at ang mga guro. Ang mga yaman na Pilipino naman, upang makaiwas sa sistemang ito, nagbabayad sila ng palya na nagkakahalaga ng 7 piso, ngunit dahil sa kahirapan, kakaunti lang ang nakakaiwas sa polo e serbisyo. Ang sistemang ito na nagbunsod sa maraming pagkaklas laban sa pamamaraan ng Espanyol sa iba't ibang panig ng bansa. Isa sa mga pinakakilala dito ang Sumuroy Revolt na pinangungunahan ni Juan Ponce Sumuroy noong 1649. Maraming gusali at gawain pampubliko ang napatayo dahil sa polo e serbisyo. Yun nga lang, maraming Pilipino ang pinahirapan sa pagtatayo nito dahil hindi rin natutupad ang 17 araw na pagtatrabaho dahil sa hindi pagsunod sa mga batas. Para sa mga Pilipino noon, lahat ito ay bunga ng pang-aapi at pang-aabuso ng mga Espanyol. Sa ating mga Pilipino noon, kapag nakakita sila ng gusali, simbahan, naalala nila kung paano sila pinahihirapan ng polo e serbisyo. Ito rin ang dahilan kung bakit mababa ang tingin ng mga tao sa gawaing manual o tinatawag na blue-collar job. Hanggang sa kasalukuyan. So ibig sabihin, pag ganun ang mga trabaho, mababa ang tingin sa kanila dahil sa alipin sila o hindi magandang pagtrato ng mga Espanyol sa panahong iyon. Nakatatak na sa isipan ng marami, ang ganitong uri ng trabaho ay simbolo ng kahirapan at pangalipin. Hindi ito nakayanan ng mga Pilipino, kaya ang patakarang ito ay isa sa naging sanhi ng pag-aasta laban sa pamahalaan ng Espanyol. Halimbawa nito, ang pag-aasa ni Sumuroy sa Samar noong 1649 at 1650. Bukod sa sapilitang paggawa, sapilitan din binili ng pamahalaang Espanyol, binili ang mga produkto ng mga magsasaka. The Bandala system was a system implemented by Spanish authorities in the Philippines that required native Filipino farmers to sell their goods to the government. Sistemang bandala ang tawag sa sapilitang pagbebenta ng mga produkto. Ang mga produkto ay binibili ng pamahalaan sa mahabang halaga, kadalasan na hindi pa ito nababayaran. Ang mga natatanggap lang ng mga magsasaka ang pangakong kasulatan o promissory note. Kapag nasira ang pananim ng mga magsasaka, napipilitan silang bumili ng produkto sa ibang lugar upang mabuo ang kota na binigay ng pamahalaan. Lalo na kadagdag sa kanilang paghihirap. Naging mahirap talaga ang pamumuhay ng mga ninuno natin na araw sa pamumuno ng mga Espanyol. Una, sariling lupa, kapag hindi nabayaran ang buwis, kukunin nila at magiging tauhan ka na lang. Ang ilang pamparaan o sistemang payanakop na ginamit ng mga Espanyol sa Pilipinas ay una ang sistema encomienda, pagbabayad ng buwis, at ang huli ang sapilitang paggawa na tinatawag na polo e servicios. Ang pagbubuwis ay paglikom ng salaping kakailanganin sa pagpapatakbo ng pamahalaan. Ginagamit ito sa pagpapanatili ng kaligtasan sa bansa o pagpapatayo ng mga paaralan, ospital at iba pang struktura, gaya ng tulay at daan. Ang buwis naman ng pagkamamayan na may katumbas na 8 piso na maaaring bayaran ng pera, produkto, gaya ng ginto, tela, bulak at bigas. May mahalagang takda sa bawat produkto. Hindi naging sapat ang buwis. Pinalitan ng sedula personal noong 1884 ang pwede kumuha at nagbabayad ng sedula na may edad na 18 na taon pataas bilang tanda ng pagkakakilanlan ng mga Pilipino at pagtanggap sa kapangyarihan ng mga Espanya. Tanging kasapi lamang ng prinsipalya at katutubong naglilingkod na sa pamahalaan ng simbahan ang hindi nagbabayad ng buwis. Ang sistemang kasama ay ang pangungupahan ng mga magsasaka sa lupaing sakaan ng mga may-aring karaniwang Espanyol.
Revolution or the act of revolting is an uprising or an attempt to put an end to the authority of a person by rebelling against them. This is one of the methods used by many Filipinos to express their nationalism and also to practice patriotism among their comrades. Revolution is widely used during the early days of Spanish colonization because during those times people have little knowledge in politics and creating propaganda, so they tried to solve problems through revolting, which is pretty straightforward solution to their opinion. Revolts during the 16th century. Dagami Revolt, 1565 to 1567. The Dagami Revolt was a revolt led by the Dagami family who came from the island of Leyte in 1567. This involved a group of 16 led by Dagami, who was the chieftain of Gabi, part of the present-day town of Palo in Leyte. The insurrection was short-lived and mainly involved assassinations of Spanish soldiers. The first incident took place on May 23, 1565 in Cebu, where the group ambushed Pedro de Arana, who was an aide to Miguel Lopez de Legazpi, the Spanish governor of the Philippines. Dagami led a series of attacks which baffled authorities for a time. By December 1566, Legazpi finally summoned the local datos and forced them to identify who the culprits were after 2 more Spaniards died of poisoning. Dagami was captured rigid and was later executed. Lacandula and Sulaiman Revolt, 1574. The Lacandula and Sulaiman Revolt, also known as the Tagalog Revolt, was an uprising in 1574 by Lacandula and Raha Sulaiman in Tondo, Manila. The revolt occurred in the same year as the Chinese pirate Limahong attacked the palisaded yet poorly defended enclosure of Intramuros. Sulaiman and Lacandula revolted because Miguel Lopez de Legazpi reneged on his side of the deal. In exchange for accepting Spanish sovereignty, Legazpi promised that Sulaiman and Lacandula would retain some of their local authority, be exempted from paying tribute, and be treated fairly. Legazpi did not fulfill his promises. When Guido de la Versaris replaced Legazpi as Governor General of the Philippines, he revoked their exemptions from paying tribute and confiscated their lands. Father Martin convinced Lacandula and Sulaiman to abort the revolt and promised to grant their privileges. Suleiman refused and continued his revolt. Suleiman's revolt was finally and brutally crushed in 1574. Pampanga Revolt, 1585. The Pampanga Revolt was an uprising in 1585 by some native Kapampangan leaders who resented the Spanish landowners or encomenderos who had deprived them of their historical land inheritances as tribal chiefs or datus. The revolt included a plot to storm Intramuros, but a conspiracy was foiled before it could begin after a Filipino woman married to a Spanish soldier reported the plot to the Spanish authorities. Spanish and Filipino colonial troops were sent by Governor General Santiago de Vera, and the leader of the revolt were arrested and summarily executed by Christian Cruz Herrera. Conspiracy of the Maharlikas, 1587 to 1588. The conspiracy of the Maharlikas or the Tondo conspiracy of 1587 to 1588 was a plot by the kin-related noblemen or datus of Manila and some towns of Bulacan and Pampanga. It was led by Agustin de Legazpi, nephew of Lacandula and his first cousin, Martin Pangan. The datus swore to revolt. The uprising failed when they were denounced to the Spanish authorities by another figure, Antonio Surabao or Susabao of Calamianes in Palawan. Revolt against the Tribute, 1589. The Cagayan and Dingras revolts against the Tribute occurred in Luzon in the present-day provinces of Cagayan and Ilocos Norte in 1589. Ilocanos, Ibanags, and other Filipinos revolted against alleged abuses by the tax collectors, including the collection of high taxes. It began when 6 tax collectors who had arrived from Vigan were killed by the natives. Governor General Santiago de Vera sent Spanish and Filipino colonial troops to pacify the rebels. The rebels were eventually pardoned and the Philippine tax system reformed. Magalat Revolt, 1596. The Magalat Revolt was an uprising in 1596 led by Magalat, a rebel from Cagayan. He had been arrested in Manila for inciting rebellion against the Spanish. He was later then released after some urging by some Dominican priests and returned to Cagayan. Together with his brother, he urged the entire country to revolt. He is said to have committed atrocities against his fellow natives for refusing to rise up against the Spaniards. He soon controlled the countryside and the Spanish eventually found themselves besieged. The Spanish Governor General Francisco de Telo de Guzman sent Pedro de Chavez from Manila with Spanish and Filipino colonial troops. They fought successfully against the rebels and captured and executed several leaders under Magalat. Magalat himself was assassinated within his fortified headquarters by his own men. Revolts during the 17th century. Igorot Revolt, 1601. By order of the Governor-General Francisco de Telo de Guzman, an expedition was sent to the Cordillera region for religious conversion of purposes with the aid of Padre Esteban Marin. Marin, the curate of Ilocos at that time, tried initially to convince the Igorots to convert peacefully to Catholicism. Marin allegedly even tried to create his own dictionary in the Igorot language to advance this cause. The Igorots, however, killed Marin and the Governor-General sent Lieutenant Mateo de Aranda with Spanish and Filipino foot soldiers. The combined force would be defeated, although the Spanish would continue using harsher tactics, including slavery of the natives, to force the Igorots to submit. Nonetheless, the Igorots would continue to defy and defeat Spanish expeditions in the years 1608, 1635, and 1663. The Chinese Revolt of 1603. In 1603, at least 30,000 Chinese merchants were slaughtered, and in Luzon, Chinese officials and civilians were killed without authority by what the Ming Shilu describes as the barbarian Spanish chieftain of Luzon. The surviving Chinese fled to Wawa, or what is now known as Guagua. This atrocity is known in Chinese history as the Luzon tragedy. The Chinese inhabitants of Manila set fire to Legarda and Binondo, and for a time threatened to capture the Moro stronghold in Intramuros. Kakenga's Revolt, 1607. In 1607, with the coming of the Dominicans into the Cagayan Valley, a priest began proselyting into the Malawig people, now Rizal, Cagayan. An animist priestess named Kakenga rebelled against the coming of the Catholic Church. She gathered people from her village and fled to the mountains to unite with another village and prepared for a war. A Dominican friar and loyal Malawig men successfully quelled the forthcoming rebellion, and Kakenga was given over to the other village as a slave. However, many of her followers rebelled, burned down a Catholic church, and started other rebellions throughout the Cagayan Valley. One rebel who desecrated an image of the Virgin Mary was executed for his offense. Tamblot Revolt, 1621 to 1622. The Tamblot Revolt, or the Tamblot Uprising, was a religious uprising in the island of Bohol, led by Tamblot in 1621. The Jesuits first came to Bohol in 1596 and eventually governed the island and converted the Boholanos to the Catholic faith. Tamblot, a babaylan or a native priest, urged his fellow Boholanos to return to the old belief of their forefathers. The revolt began on the day when the Jesuits were in Cebu, celebrating the feast day of Saint Francis Xavier. It was finally crushed on New Year's Day in 1622. Tamblot was executed and his head was set on a pike and displayed to serve as a warning to the populace. Bangkao Revolt, 1621 to 1622. The Bangkao Revolt was a religious uprising against Spanish colonial rule led by Bangkao, the dato of Carigara, in the present-day Carigara in Leyte. Bangkao had warmly received Miguel Lopez de Legazpi as his guest when he first arrived in the Philippines in 1565. Although baptized as a Catholic in his youth, he abandoned his faith in later years. With a babaylan or a religious leader named Pagali, he built a temple for a diwata or local goddess, and pressed 6 towns to rise up in revolt. Similar to the Tamblot uprising, Pagali used magic to attract followers and claimed that they could turn the Spaniards into clay by hurling bits of earth at them. Governor General Alonso Fajardo de Entenza sent the Alcalde Mayor of Cebu, Juan de Alcarazo, with Spanish and foot soldier colonial troops to suppress the rebellion. Bangkao's severed head was impaled on a bamboo stake and displayed to the public as a warning. One of his sons was also beheaded and one of the babaylans was burned at the stake. 3 other followers were executed by firing squad. Itneg Revolt, 1625 to 1627. The Itneg Revolt or the Mandaya Revolt was a religious uprising led by Miguel Lanab and Alababan. The two were previously baptized as Catholics against their will and were from the Itneg or Mandaya tribe of Kapinatan in northwestern Cagayan in the Philippines. The region is now part of the landlocked province of Apayao. Miguel Lanab and Alababan killed, beheaded, and mutilated 2 Dominican missionaries, Father Alonso Garcia and Brother Onofre Palau, who were sent by the Chinese colonial government to convert the Itneg people to Christianity. After cutting Father Garcia's body into pieces, they fed his flesh into a herd of pigs. Afterwards, they compelled their fellow Itnegs to loot, desecrate Catholic images, set fire to the local churches, and escape with them to the mountains. In 1626, Governor General Fernando de Silva sent Spanish and foot soldier colonial troops to suppress the rebellion. They destroyed farms and other sources of food to starve the Itnegs and forced them to surrender in 1627. Ladia Revolt, 1643. Pedro Ladia was a Moro Bornean and self-claimed descendant of Lacandula, who came to Malolos in 1643. At that time, his land was confiscated by the Spanish, and he thought that it was about time that they staged an uprising and put himself as the king of the Tagalogs. This was despite the fact that a parish priest tried to convince him not to pursue his plans. Upon his capture, he was brought to Manila where he was executed. Sumuroy Revolt, 1649 to 1650. In the town of Palapag today in northern Samar, Agustin Sumuroy and some of his followers rose in arms on June 1, 1649 over the polo y servicio, or forced labor system being undertaken in Samar. This is known as the Sumuroy Revolt, named after Agustin Sumuroy. The government in Manila directed that all natives subject to the polo are not to be sent to distant places, distant from their hometowns to do their forced labor. However, under orders of the various town alcaldes or mayors, the Waray were being sent to the shipyards of Cavite to do their polo y servicio, which sparked the revolt. The local parish priest of Palapag was murdered, and the revolt eventually spread to Mindanao, Bicol, and the rest of Visayas, especially in places such as Cebu, Masbate, Camiguin, Zamboanga, Albay, Camarines, and parts of northern Mindanao, such as Surigao. A rebel government was successfully established in the mountains of Samar. The defeat, capture, and execution of Sumuroy in June 1650 delivered a big setback to the revolt. His trusted co-conspirator David Dula sustained the quest for freedom with greater vigor, but in a fierce battle several years later, he was wounded, captured, and later executed in Palapag, northern Samar. The Spaniards together with his 7 key lieutenants. Maniago, Pampanga Revolt, 1660 to 1661. The Maniago was an uprising in Pampanga during the 1660s named after its leader, Francisco Maniago. During that time, Pampanga drew most of the attention from the Spanish religious orders because of its relative wealth. They also bore the burden of more tribute, forced labor, and rice exploitation. They were made to work for 8 months under unfair conditions and were not paid for their labor and for the rice purchased from them. Their patience was put to the limit, and they signified their intention to revolt by setting their campsite on fire. The fight soon began, and because the Spaniards were busy fighting against the Dutch, they were badly depleted by the Kapampangans. The Maniago Revolt was the start of a much bigger and even bloodier revolt in Pangasinan. This battle was led by a man named Andres Malong who had heeded the call of Maniago to revolt against the Spaniards. After hearing news of a Kapampangan chief siding with the Spaniards, Maniago and his forces arranged for a meeting with Governor General Sambiniano Manrique de Lara, in which they gave their conditions to end their rebellion. Appeased and satisfied with the conditions of the agreement, the Governor General accepted the demands, after which Maniago and his forces gave up the rebellion. Malong Revolt, 1660 to 1661. Andres Malong was the Maestro de Campo of Binalotongan, now San Carlos City in Pangasinan, in the 1660s. He assisted many Spaniards in governing different towns in Pangasinan, and as such had learned and was trained to use force and cruelty. He hoped of being the king of the province, however, set this plan aside when a war led by Francisco Maniago broke out in Pampanga. Malong started his campaign in a small barangay called Malonguey, but failed. Having the same condition as in Pampanga, he led the people in Pangasinan to take up arms against the Spaniards. It spread like wildfire in Pangasinan. Because of his success, he proclaimed himself King of Pangasinan. Almazan Revolt, January 1661. A part of the chain to the Malong Revolt was the Ilocos Revolt led by Don Pedro Almazan, illustrious and wealthy leader of San Nicolas, Lawag, Ilocos Norte. The letters were sent by Don Andres Malong, or King of Pangasinan, narrating the defeat of the Spaniards in his area and urging other provinces to rise in arms, but failed to obtain any support among the natives. During the revolt, Don Pedro Almazan proclaimed himself King of Ilocos but was later captured and executed. He also had a son which the Ilocanos proclaimed their prince. Chinese Revolt of 1662. Fearing an invasion of Chinese led by the famous pirate Koxinga, the garrisons around Manila were reinforced. An increasing anti-Chinese sentiment grew within much of the population. In the end, the invasion did not materialize, but many locals massacred hundreds of Chinese in the Manila area. Panay Revolt, 1663. The Panay Revolt was a religious uprising in 1663 that involved Tapar, a native of the island of Panay, who wanted to establish a religious cult in the town of Oton. He attracted some followers with his stories about his frequent conversations with the demon. Tapar and his men were killed in a bloody skirmish against Spanish and colonial foot soldier troops, and their corpses were impaled on stakes. Zambal Revolt, 1681 to 1683. A group of chieftains from Zambales had refused to accept the authority of the crown over their realm and staged a revolt. The Spanish were very swift to respond and sent a colonial force of 6,000 foot soldiers and suppressed the uprising. After 2 years of the conflict, the Spanish had pacified the entire area of Zambales, and all of the chieftains who participated in the revolt were executed. Revolts during the 18th century will be reported by Vincent Costello.
Philippine revolts against Spain, the 18th century. Agrarian Revolt of 1745. The Agrarian Revolt undertaken between the years 1745 and 1746 in much of the present-day Calabarzon, specifically Batangas, Laguna, and Cavite. Thomas Sinaguingan is the acting leader of this revolt. The cause of this revolt is the disruption of Filipino lands by religious order. Filipino landowners rose in arms over the land grabbing of the Spanish friars, with native landowners demanding the Spanish priests return their lands on the basis of ancestral domain. The refusal of the Spanish priests resulted in much rioting, resulting in the massive looting of convents and arson of churches and ranches. The case was eventually investigated by the Spanish officials and was even heard in the court of King Philip IV, in which he ordered the priests to return the lands they seized. The priest was successfully able to appeal the return of lands back to the natives, which resulted in no land being returned to the native landowners. The Dagohoy Rebellion from 1744 to 1825. In 1744, in what is now the province of Bohol, what is known today as the Dagohoy Revolt was undertaken by Francisco Dagohoy and his followers. This revolt is unique since it is the only revolt completely related to matters of religious customs, unlike the Tumbled uprising before it, which was not a complete religious rebellion. The cause of this revolt is the refusal of Father Morales to bury the body of Dagohoy's brother in consecrated grounds. His brother died after a duel, and local parish priests refused to give his brother a proper Christian burial, since dueling is a sin. The refusal of the priest to give his brother a proper Christian burial eventually led to the longest revolt ever held in the Philippines history, which took up to 85 years. This also led to the establishment of a free Boholano government. Dagohoy died 2 years before the revolt ended, which led to the end of the revolt in 1829. Silang Revolt, arguably one of the most famous revolts in the Philippine history, is the Silang Revolt from 1762 to 1763. Led by the couple Diego Silang and Gabriela Silang. Unlike the other revolts, this revolt took place during the British occupation of Manila. On December 14, 1762, Diego Silang declared the independence of Ilocania, naming the state Free Ilocos, and proclaimed Vigan the capital of this newly independent state. The British heard about this revolt in Manila and even asked the help of Silang in fighting the Spanish. Diego Silang was killed by Miguel Vicos, a friend of Silang. The Spanish authorities paid for his murder, leading to his death in the arms of his wife, Gabriela. She continued her husband's struggles, earning the title Joan of Arc of the Ilocos because of her many victories in battle. On September 10, 1763, the revolt ended with the defeat of Ilocanos. Gabriela Silang was executed by Spanish authorities in Vigan. Palares Revolt from 1762 to 1764. During the British invasion of Manila during the Seven-Year War, the Spanish colonial government, including Villacorta, had relocated to Bacolor in the province of Pampanga, which was the adjacent to Pangasinan. It was at this time that the Principalia of Binalatogonan protested the abuse committed by the provincial governor. The town leader demanded the governor to remove and that the colonial government stop collecting taxes since the islands were already under British control at that time. But Governor General Simon de Anda dismissed the demands and the revolt broke out in November 1762. The name of De la Cruz, who began to be known as Palares, emerged as one of the leaders of the revolt, along with his brother Colette, Andres Lopez, and Juan de Vera Ocantin. The cause of this revolt is the demand for reforms, especially the exchange of local officials. This was to push the government to fulfill the petition of the people. They went to Andres Melendez, who was at the time the head of the friars in Lingayen, presenting the following petitions of the people: the return of taxes paid by the people for the year 1762. Filipinos sent to Mindanao to fight against the Moros should not be charged with taxes. The 4 persons that guard the prisoners should wear polo, so as to show that they are not working for free. That the schoolmaster of all boys was to be stripped of his position because of his slyness. Don Joaquin Gamboa should be removed from his office as the alcalde mayor of the province. Andres Lopez, a native, must be granted permanence of the master of the camp of the province of henceforth. This position must be exclusive to the citizen of Binalatogon. February 26, 1765, while in detention, he confessed being the principal leader of the revolt. He was convinced and hanged. Also, the removal of all schoolmasters and churches official, including the convents under the Spaniards in the event that the above-mentioned petition are not met. 19th century. First one is the Basi Revolt of 1801. The Basi Revolt, also known as the Ambaristo Revolt, was a revolt undertaken from September 16 to 28, 1807. It was led by Pedro Mateo and Salagoro Ambaristo. When its events occurring in the present-day town in Pidig in Ilocos Norte, this revolt is unique as it revolves around the Ilocanos for Ilocanos' love for Basi or sugarcane wine. The cause of this revolt is the government monopoly of Basi or wine manufacture. Ilocanos were forced to buy from the government stores. On September 16, 1807, wine-loving Ilocanos in Pidig rose in revolt. Spanish-led troops eventually killed on September 28, 1807. Novales Revolt from 1823. The Novales Revolt of 1823 was an uprising led by Captain Andres Novales, who was dissatisfied with the treatment according to the Creoles or Insulares by Spanish authorities. The revolt erupted on June 1st, 1823, and was immediately ceased on the eve of the 2nd of June, 1823, or the following day. As punishment for betraying the Spanish crown, Captain Novales was ordered to be executed. It was acknowledged as the shortest revolt in Philippine history. Pule Revolt. One of the most famous religious revolts is the Pule Revolt, more formally known as Religious Revolt of Hermano Pule. Undertaken between 1840 and November 1841. This revolt was led by Apolinario de la Cruz, otherwise known as Hermano Pule. De la Cruz started his own religious order, the Confraternity of Saint Joseph, in Lucban, located in present-day province of Quezon. In June 1840, however, there were 2 types of priests in the Philippines. Secular priests or parish priests, which were usually Indio, and religious priests or convent priests, which were usually Spanish. The cause of this revolt is being a native, Puli was denied a mission as a monk. He founded the religious brotherhood Confraternity of Saint Joseph, which was the government outlaw outlawed, and ordered dissolved. Due to this, the Spanish government sent in troops to forcibly break up the order, forcing De la Cruz and his followers to rise in armed revolt in self-defense. On November 4, 1841, the Spaniards eventually won and De la Cruz executed in Tayabas. One of the reasons why did the revolts through the years failed, due to the lack of national leaders, an absence of nationalism, and unpreparedness of rebels.
Propaganda. A propaganda is the dissemination or manipulation of information that is sometimes biased or misleading in nature. This is used to influence public opinion that is either to promote their cause or to publicly destroy the personality. So, propaganda, ito yung mga programa or mga akda, mga written literatures na ang laman is katulad nung nasa nakalagay, bias or misleading, or may pinapanigan sila, or they use propaganda to publicly destroy the image of the personality that they oppose. Propaganda movement. A propaganda movement is a peaceful crusade or campaign for reforms was done by means of pen and tongue to pressure. It was organized and participated by the Ilustrados. So Ilustrados or the enlightened ones, because they are Filipino students during the Spanish regime that studied in Spain, but their hearts was loyal to Philippines. So they are the ones doing the propaganda movement. Since they are knowledgeable, they use literature to write newspapers that exposes the abuse done by the Spanish. Propagandists were brave writers who exposed the exploitation of the Spaniards to Filipinos. So, mga writers sila, nagsusulat sila sa dyaryo. Nakasulat sa mga dyaryo na to yung kung paano inaabuso ng mga Espanyol yung mga Pilipino. In turn, pag nabasa to ng maraming Pilipino, magagalit sila, which will in turn in a more revolution that consists more people than the past revolutions. The aims of the propaganda movement is the Spaniards and the Filipinos must be treated equally before the law. The Philippines to become a province of Spain. The Philippine representation in the Cortes Legislature of Spain. Filipino priests to be assigned as parish priests. The Filipinos to enjoy their rights as humans. So, ang aim ng propaganda movement is para mamulat yung mga tao na kailangan nilang ipaglaban yung patas na pagtingin sa kanila ng mga Espanyol. La Solidaridad. It was originally an organization founded in Spain, headed by Jose Rizal's cousin Gallicano Apacible. It is also issued a newspaper. The official newspaper that was edited by Graciano Lopez Haina was the venue for all political writing of the propaganda movement. So lahat ng propaganda ay dyan sa La Solidaridad newspaper nilalagay yung mga pang-aabuso ng mga Espanyol sa mga Pilipino. Círculo Hispano-Filipino is an organization composed of Filipino and Spaniards whose aim is to reform the Philippines during Spanish colonization. It was established in 1882, led by Juan Ataide. So, this is another organization which is most focused, na-form siya dito sa Pilipinas. Unlike ng La Solidaridad, yung organization which is found in Spain. Revista del Círculo Hispano-Filipino, their newspaper which is edited by Graciano Lopez Haina. It is the official newspaper of the Círculo Hispano-Filipino, just like the La Solidaridad newspaper that was published by the La Solidaridad, the organization.
Propagandists and their propaganda. Graciano Lopez Haina was born in Haro, Iloilo, in the Captaincy General of the Philippines in the Spanish Empire on December 18, 1856. His parents were Placido Lopez and Maria Jacoba Haina. He was baptized as Graciano Lopez Haina on December 20, 1856 at Haro Church. Graciano Lopez Haina is the first editor-in-chief. In 1889, he established La Solidaridad in Barcelona. He is an accomplished orator and writer. His works are Fray Batod, or Big-Bellied Friar, Esperanzas, and La Hija del Fraile. He died because of tuberculosis. Jose Protasio Rizal Mercado Alonso y Realonda, or also known as Jose Rizal, was a Filipino nationalist and polymath during the tail end of the Spanish colonial period of the Philippines. He is considered the national hero of the Philippines. He was born in Calamba, Laguna on June 19, 1861. Laong Laang and De Masalang were his pen names. His famous works are Noli Me Tangere and El Filibusterismo. He dedicated El Filibusterismo to the Gomburza, Gomez, Burgos, and Zamora. He is the most outstanding among the propagandists on December 30, 1896. Rizal was shot to death by a firing squad at Bagong Bayan. Marcelo H. Del Pilar, and also known by his pen name Plaridel, was a Filipino writer, lawyer, journalist, and Freemason. Del Pilar, along with Jose Rizal and Graciano Lopez Haina, became known as the leaders of the reform movement in Spain. Marcelo H. Del Pilar is the political analyst of the propaganda movement and the greatest journalist produced by the Filipino race. He replaced Haina as the editor-in-chief of La Solidaridad. He founded Diaryong Tagalog. He used the pen name Plaridel, Piping de Lat, and Dolores Manapat. His famous works are Dasalan na Tuksuhan, Kaiingat Kayo, Sagot ng Espanya sa Hibik ng Pilipinas. And the other propagandists with their pen names, Antonio Luna, Taga-Ilog, Jose Maria Panganiban, Homapa, Mariano Ponce, Tikbalang, Naning, or Kalipulaco.
Reason for failure of the propaganda movement. The propaganda movement did not succeed in its pursuit of reforms. The colonial government did not agree to any of its demands. Spain itself was undergoing a lot of internal problems all the time, which could explain why the mother country failed to heed the Filipino petition. In addition, the propaganda movement languished after Rizal's arrest and the collapse of Liga Filipina. La Solidaridad went out of business in November 1895, and in 1896, both Del Pilar and Lopez Haina died in Barcelona, worn down by poverty and disappointment. As the time came from financial support to propaganda movement, the manpower for Filipino who support the propaganda getting smaller and smaller until it reached the end of it. And as the result of propaganda movement, they removed the tobacco monopoly in our country. The 40 days of forced labor became 15 days a year. The tribute was replaced to cedula tax. They were unsuccessful in convincing the Spaniards to grant out their reforms. Due to leadership, it was one of them fall down ever since Rizal was executed. There were no respective representative of the said propaganda. The execution of Rizal breathed new life into the insurrection, and the Philippine Revolution spread the province of Pangasinan, Zambales, and Ilocos.